Hello, I'm Rabbi David Abramson, one of the chaplains at the Hebrew Home. The Torah portion this week is Parashat Bahar, and I'd like to spend a little time studying the portion with you. In order to study the portion, I'd like to share a handout with you, which includes some passages from the Torah portion as well as other materials. We begin with the passage from this week's Torah portion from Leviticus chapter 25, and I will warn you, this passage from the Torah portion is going to be troubling. Let's jump in. We begin with verse 39. V'chiyamuch achicha imach v'nimkar lach. If your brother becomes impoverished and must sell himself to you, lo ta'avod bo avodat aved. You shall not subject him to the treatment of a normal slave. Kisachir ketoshav yihye imach, he shall remain with you as a hired bound laborer. From this first verse, from verse 39, we see that in biblical times, indeed in the ancient world, it was not uncommon for people to sell themselves to other people or to be sold to other people. A person who found himself or herself so mired in debt that it seemed unlikely that he or she would be able to get out of debt could sell himself or herself to another person as a way of paying off his or her debt. What is significant, of course, is that in the ancient world, and according to Torah law, it was possible for a person to sell himself or herself to another person. But in addition to telling us that a person might legitimately sell himself or herself to another person, the second part of this first verse, verse 39, tells us that you shall not subject him to the treatment of a normal slave. Now I'm going to highlight a couple words. So we see three words in this passage, three forms of the Hebrew word eved, which is translated sometimes as slave and sometimes as servant. And that's one of the troubling aspects of this passage. A person may become an eved to another person. A person may sell himself or herself to another person. But lo ta'avod bo avodat aved. You shall not subject him to the treatment of a normal slave. Rather, verse 40, Kisachir ketoshav yihye imach, he shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer, ad shenat hayovel ya'avod imach, only until the Jubilee year shall he serve you. Every 50 years in biblical times, the Jubilee, the Yovel, the Jubilee year was declared, and on that 50th year, among other things, avadim, people who had sold themselves into servitude, were to be set free. Verse 41, V'yatsa me'imach hu uvanav imo, then he and his children with him shall be free of your authority. V'shav el mishpachto v'el achuzat avotav yashuv. He shall go back to his family and return to his ancestral landholding. Verse 42, Ki avadai heim, asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. For they, the Israelites, for they are my servants. This is God speaking. For they are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. Lo yemachru mimkeret aved. They shall not be sold simply as slaves. Lo tirdevo befarech. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly. V'yareta me Elohecha. And you shall fear your God. So we see a number of things in this verse. Number one, the fact that according to biblical law, it is legitimate for a person to sell himself or herself to another person. It is legitimate for a person to become an eved to another person. But remember, verse 42 tells us, for they are my servants. The Israelites are my servants. The end of verse 42 says, they shall not be sold simply as slaves. The fact is that when we use the term eved, it means different things depending on the context. Sometimes when the Torah uses the term eved, slave, It means the kind of avadim, slaves, that we were in Egypt. At the beginning of the Seder, we declare, avadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. That kind of slaves, the kind of slaves that we were in Egypt, the kind of people that have no rights at all, no freedoms at all, no dignity at all. It's slavery in the worst sense of the word. But that's not the only use of the word eved in biblical sources and in Jewish sources generally. For example, when Moses is described as Eved Adonai, a servant of God, notice that I used a different English word, servant, because that has a different connotation than slave. But the Hebrew word is the same, but the connotation is different. Avadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt. That's the worst kind of slavery. But Moses, as Eved Adonai, servant of God, that's a title of distinction. It's a privilege to be a servant of God. And as a matter of fact, all Jews are considered servants of God, as verse 42 says explicitly, Ki avadai heim, for they, the Israelites, are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They went from being avadim, slaves to Pharaoh, and after the Exodus, and when they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, they became avadim to me. As a matter of fact, one of the most frequently quoted passages from the book of Psalms is, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, let us serve God in joy. So being an Eved is not always bad. What is the Torah talking about here in Parshat Bahar? They're not talking about a person who joyfully chooses to serve God, to be an Eved Adonai, but rather a person who, because of financial difficulty, has sold himself or herself to another person. And so the troubling question still remains. How is it that the Torah legitimizes avdut? I hesitated to translate that as slavery because it's not exactly the same as slavery. Let's explore what it meant to be an Eved Ivri. There are a number of ways to answer this question. Part of the answer comes from other ways in which the Torah speaks about an Eved Ivri, and another part of the answer comes from the way the rabbis understand the institution of the Eved Ivri. First, from Deuteronomy chapter 15. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. Arguably, it's traumatic becoming an Eved. The circumstances that lead a person to sell himself or herself to another person are traumatic experiences. Becoming an Eved is a trauma. In addition, an accident, a workplace accident, for example, in which a person loses an eye, that's another trauma. And so the Torah essentially says it's too much. In addition to the trauma of becoming an Eved, now the trauma of losing an eye, because of that second trauma, an Eved deserves to be given his freedom immediately. Exodus chapter 21. When you do set him free, do not let him go empty-handed. Furnish him out of the flock, threshing floor, and bat with which Adonai your God has blessed you. Setting an Eved free is not simply a matter of saying, goodbye, you're free, have a good day. But rather, there's a responsibility that the now former owner of the Eved has toward the now former Eved. Set that person up with sufficient food and provisions so that the transition to the life of a free person can be an easier one. So those are two examples of what the Torah itself tells us an owner of an Eved owes to that Eved. Another example. This is from Exodus chapter 20, from the Ten Commandments. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of Adonai your God. You shall not do any work, You, your son or daughter, your eved or amma, your male or female servant. Everybody is not only allowed to have a day off, that's what Shabbat is, but everybody is required to have a day off. And the person who has the control over a family farm or a family business or what have you is required to give a day off, not only to one's own children, to one's own household, also to one's avadim. Your male and your female avadim also must have a day off on Shabbat. So those are a couple of examples of what the Torah tells us we owe an eved during the period of servitude. And of course, from Deuteronomy 15, we are admonished, V'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim, v'yitecha Adonai Elohecha. Bear in mind that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and Adonai your God redeemed you. And this commandment, to remember that you were slaves, is not just a simple platitude, but rather a requirement to remember not only in your mind that you were slaves, and the implication of that fact on the way you treat your own avadim, if you are in a circumstance in which you own other human beings. And now we turn to rabbinic literature for the next part of our exploration. We turn first to Moses Maimonides' monumental code of Jewish law, known as the Mishnah Torah, which Maimonides composed in the late 12th century. Here's what he tells us, what Maimonides tells us about the job description, so to speak, of an Eved Ivri, of an indentured servant. It is forbidden for an Israelite purchaser of a Hebrew servant to put him to menial tasks, such as carrying his belongings to the bathhouse or untying his shoes. As it is written, you shall not subject him to the treatment of a normal slave. It's okay for him to cut his master's hair or launder his clothes, but don't make him do that stuff publicly. That adds another element of relative humiliation about which the master, the owner of an Eved, should be sensitive. Elsewhere, Maimonides writes the following, first quoting the verse from Leviticus, Lo tirdovo b'farech, you shall not rule over him ruthlessly. So Maimonides asks, and then answers the question, what is it that constitutes ruthless imposition of labor? Maimonides writes, this is work which has no fixed time and is needed by no man, but is simply imposed for the sake of working him, that he should not be idle. In a nutshell, what's Maimonides saying here? Don't give your Eved busy work. And finally, a rabbinic source known as the Sifra tells us about the living conditions of an Eved Ivri. First, by quoting also part of that passage from Leviticus 25. Kisachir ketoshav yihyeh imach. He shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer. He shall be imach, with you. And so the Sifra says, imach b'ma'achal, with you regarding food. Imach b'mishteh, with you regarding drink. Imach b'chsut nikiyah, with you regarding clean apparel. In other words, you owe your Eved more or less the same standard of living vis-a-vis food and drink and clothing that you enjoy yourself. The Sifra goes on, you shall not dine on white bread while he dines on black bread. You shall not drink old, that is superior wine, while he drinks new, that is inferior wine. You shall not sleep on a feather bed while he sleeps with straw. Whatever standard of living the master can afford for himself, he owes to his avadim, he owes to his servant. So we see both in terms of job description and in terms of living conditions, there are all sorts of requirements, regulations, requirements, expectations, limitations that are imposed on the owner of an Eved. And all of these rules become so burdensome for the owner that the Talmud asserts, Kol hakoneh eved ivri ki koneh adon la'atzmo. Whoever acquires a Hebrew servant acquires a master over himself. Let's turn now to the pen of Salo W. Braune, who was one of the leading Jewish historians of the 20th century. And Braune wrote the following: the local Hebrew slave began to disappear altogether toward the end of the Second Commonwealth. So we're talking about 19 or 20 centuries ago. A whole system of laws was evolved to eliminate every conceivable abuse and finally to abolish the institution. In the light of this and other protective laws in similar vein, it is easy to understand the popular proverb, whoever buys a Hebrew slave acquires a master unto himself. And there Braune was quoting the passage in the Talmud that we just read. And Braune concludes, indeed, the Hebrew slave seems eventually to have gone out of existence. So what do we have in this week's Torah portion? We have a description of an institution in which it is legitimate for one Israelite to own another Israelite. And during that period of ownership, whatever the owned Israelite produces belongs to the master. Damn it. We've seen the description of an institution in which it is legitimate, according to the Torah, for one human being to own another human being, for one person to be an eved of another person. But the same passage in the Torah also reminds us that we were avadim, that God liberated us from our enslavement, but the fact of our enslavement imposes certain obligations on an Israelite who acquires ownership of another Israelite. We've seen examples of biblical law and rabbinic law humanizing the institution of being an Eved Ivri, such that even using the translation slave is a little bit of a misnomer. Being an Eved Ivri was not as terrible as having been avadim was for us in Egypt. But here's my struggle with this portion and with the institution of the Eved Ivri. Even if Braune is right in affirming that this sort of disappeared from the Jewish world close to 2 millennia ago, nevertheless, the Torah does legitimize one human being owning another human being. And this is what a lot of people were talking about 160 or 170 years ago, when the issue of slavery in 19th century America was being hotly debated. Of course, it led ultimately to the Civil War and to the end of slavery in America. But in the meantime, in the years leading up to and during the Civil War, there were abolitionists and there were anti-abolitionists. There were people who advocated the abolition of slavery in 19th century America, and there were people who defended slavery in 19th century America, including Christian clergy and including some rabbis who essentially asked rhetorically, if God legitimizes this kind of servitude, who are we to assert here in 19th century America that slavery should be abolished? Are we smarter than God? Is our moral judgment greater than God's moral judgment? I'm not defending the argument. The argument is immoral. It was immoral to enslave human beings in 19th century America. It was necessary for America to end slavery. But what do we do with this passage in the Torah? Should we simply be embarrassed that the Torah permitted slavery? I'm not embarrassed. Am I ashamed that the Torah legitimized this kind of servitude? Not tremendously, because I'm much more proud of the fact that Judaism, as it unfolded, put the institution of the Eved Ivri out of business. And so this passage in this week's Torah portion, which at first glance is a very troubling passage, gives us the opportunity to learn and relearn the wonderful way in which Jewish tradition grows and changes and challenges us over the course of our history to grow in moral sensitivity and to grow in responsiveness to the moral demands of Jewish tradition. Shabbat Shalom.